Hello, this is review number 9 for the AP US History exam. This review is entitled World War II through the 1950s. Okay, here we go. The Axis powers. The Axis powers are really three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan. It's called the Tripartite Treaty. It's just this friendly treaty between all three countries. Cash and carry. What this means is we are trying to learn from World War I, where we were loaning stuff or we were sending stuff to the Allies, and then they owed us money, and because of that, then we're tied more to the Allies, which eventually brings us into one of the reasons that it brings us into World War I. And so, cash and carry. This is part of the Neutrality Acts of 1930s. It says that countries can buy stuff from the United States, but you must come over here in your own ships. You must pay for it in advance, and then you must carry it away in your own ships, thus avoiding our ships, the United States ships, being sunk. The Lend-Lease Act in 1941 was really meant to help Britain fight off the Nazis. Remember, by 1941, Britain is the only country now fighting against Germany. And so, coming up to World War II, we are much less isolationist than we were in World War I. Franklin Roosevelt made no qualms about wanting to help the Allies, although he knew that he could not get the United States involved in the war. He did know that he could help Britain in different ways, and one of those ways is the Lend-Lease Act. Essentially what this is we will lend you stuff, and then at the end of the war, when you're done using it, either you return it to us or you pay for it later. Pearl Harbor, of course, this is where the Japanese attack the United States. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Why did the Japanese attack? Because of our embargo against Japan. Remember, we talked about in the last review that we had this embargo. Anything that Japan could use for war materials, we are not going to send over to Japan. Plus, the Japanese knew that the United States was eventually going to get involved in the war, and they wanted to strike first, hopefully sinking our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. They did not find the aircraft carriers there at Pearl Harbor, but what they did find were our battleships, which they sunk a number of our battleships, and but a few months later we were able to raise most of those battleships, and they were put into combat. What did Vaqueros do during World War II? They are guest agricultural workers from Mexico mainly. Now remember the situation with Mexicans. During World War I, we are bringing them in to help with farming. After World War I, during the Great Depression, we send them back to Mexico. During World War II, we invite them back in to grow food. After World War II, we are going to ask that they are going to leave again, and that's not going to work out so well. Women in World War II, the iconic figure of women working in World War II is Rosie the Riveter. She's a symbol of women working. As men are going out to war, it's the women who are populating those factories and working in those factories. 5 years after the war, most of those women had left those factory jobs. As men are coming back, women are going back into the home and being those homemakers like what we see in the 1950s. The GI Bill. GI Bill is very, very important for the United States after World War II. What this does is it gives money, low interest loans, first of all, for homes, and so we see the rise of the suburbs with the expanding highways out there. So highways are going to go out to the suburbs, and then people are going to be able to use those highways to get back into the city to work. So people are going to be able to buy homes fairly cheaply, low interest loans anyway, and it also gives money for higher education. And so in the 1950s, we see a lot of former GIs going to college and getting that college degree, making America a very, very educated population. A map on Nazi expansionism. You may see a map that is completely blacked out of Europe. Well, completely blacked out except for a couple different places. This is probably a map of where the Nazis had made it to before being turned back. Remember, the Nazis by 1942 had made their way deep inside the Soviet Union, but you will not see Italy covered, you will not see Spain covered, you will not see Portugal or Switzerland or England. So if you see a map kind of like that, chances are it's a map of World War II. The strategy of World War II. The United States strategy for World War II is to defeat Germany first. 75% of our supplies, 75% of our troops, 75% of our effort goes to defeating the Nazis. Then once we have defeated the Nazis, we're going to turn all our attention to the Japanese. That doesn't mean we're not fighting the Japanese during or before defeating the Germans, but most of our effort is going toward defeating the Nazis. Why did the United States enter the war? All of the following except, well, obviously you don't have choices there, but the idea of the Nazis killing Jews during the Holocaust was not a reason why the United States entered the war. There were several instances where the United States could have bombed railroad tracks going into these death camps. We knew where these camps were. We could have bombed those camps, but we did nothing in order to try to end the war quicker against Germany. Where did the United States troops attack in World War II? Now remember, there are three different ways that we're attacking Berlin. Berlin is our ultimate goal. And so the United States, along with Allied powers, are going through Northern Africa first, and then taking that left turn, going up through Italy, where we fight mainly Germans, not Italians in Italy. And then we're pushing the Germans from the south to the north, trying to get to Berlin. The Soviets are going from east to west, which is very, very important because as the Soviets are moving further west, trying to get to Berlin, they are leaving troops in all those Eastern European countries. That's going to play a major role in the Cold War because the Soviet Union is going to control all of that Eastern Europe. And then, of course, June of 1944, we have the Allies attacking in northern France, D-Day, Normandy invasion, and then pushing from west to east. So we're attacking Berlin from three different directions. The internment of Japanese Americans, the key word here is Japanese Americans. These are Americans with Japanese ancestry. Most of them are born here. Some of them have obtained their citizenship since moving here. But regardless, over 100,000 Japanese Americans are interned in the center part of the country. So places like Wyoming and Colorado are going to set up these internment camps for Japanese citizens. Now, obviously, the problem for Japanese losing their freedom, that's going to be a major issue. But realistically, what's going on is most of these Japanese have been living in California, and they're given 24 to 48 hours to sell all their stuff and to make it to one of these internment camps. Well, so all of these Japanese lose a lot of land. Most Americans most whites in California know if they just wait for 48 hours, they can walk over and just take over that land that was previously owned by the Japanese. United States, U.S. people's reaction to the atomic bomb. Generally, the World War II generation does not have a problem with dropping the bomb. It's going to be their kids who have an issue with atomic warfare using atomic bombs. But the World War II generation, for the most part, are okay with dropping the two bombs on Japan. Main reasons why we drop the bombs. First of all, to end the war quickly. Remember, we're looking at having to kill a couple million Japanese in order to take over the island of Japan. We're looking at 200,000 to 300,000 American soldiers being killed. Plus, we're looking at the involvement of the Soviet Union in this fight in Asia, and we don't want that to happen. And so dropping the bomb, first of all, is going to end the war quicker. It's going to save lives, but it's also going to send a message to the Soviet Union that says, hey, listen, we know that you're going to take over most of Eastern Europe. We just don't want you to get too crazy in Asia. The United States dropped the bomb for all of the following except because the Japanese invaded the United States. Now, that was a concern from most Americans that the Japanese were going to attack in California and push all the way west to maybe as far east as Kansas, but of course that never happened. Origins or causes of the Cold War. Yalta in February of 1945 talks about what will Europe look like after World War II. And really what we understand coming out of Yalta is that Stalin is going to take over most of Eastern Europe. Even though Stalin promises free elections in those different countries, and he does offer those free elections in those Eastern European countries, he throws out all those elections when nobody votes for the Communist Party. Events of the Cold War, real fast, partitioning Germany. This is the Potsdam Agreement in 1945. Potsdam said that the United States, Britain, and France would divide up Western Germany and Western Berlin, rebuild those areas, and then the Soviet Union would rebuild Eastern Germany and Eastern Berlin, rebuild those areas. And then we would have free elections to allow the people of Germany to decide what government they want to go under. Of course, that last part is not going to happen. Containment, Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, all happens in 1947. NATO in 1949. The Berlin Blockade in 1948, going into 1949. Remember, the Berlin Blockade is not the same thing as the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall happens later. Berlin Blockade happens 1948, 1949. The Soviet Union and the atomic bomb, or Soviet Union gets the atomic bomb in 1949. Both the United States and Soviet Union successfully detonate a hydrogen bomb in 1952. Sputnik is launched in 57, and the U-2 incident in 59. So let's go ahead and go through some of those words that we touched on with the events of the Cold War. First of all, containment. This idea, written by George Kennan, a U.S. diplomat, initially wrote these ideas under the pen name of Mr. X, to try to be anonymous. Containment is this idea of we don't need to defeat communism, but we do need to contain it where it's at right now. And so initially the focus is going to be on Greece and Turkey. It looked like the communists are going to take over Greece and Turkey, and so Truman got $400 million in order to defend Greece and Turkey. This is going to be called the Truman Doctrine, defending Greece and Turkey. Now, this Truman Doctrine is going to expand to generally Western Europe, and so what can we do to keep these countries free? We are going to be much more internationalist after World War II than we were after World War I. Remember, after World War I, we become very, very isolationist. The Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan is going to give $12 billion to Western European countries to help them rebuild. We understand that after World War II, all of these European cities are destroyed. People don't have jobs. People don't have money. And this is the prime area that communism is going to look for. People who are desperate are looking for someone to say, okay, we're going to give you some food, we're going to give you a place to live, we're going to give you a job. It may not be the ones that you want, but you're going to have them. So the Marshall Plan gives $12 billion to Western European countries to help them rebuild. And the important thing about this is that in no place that got the Marshall Plan money were they ever threatened by communism. NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a collection of Western European countries to protect each other from the threat of Soviet expansion. An attack on one of these countries is an attack on all of these countries. In response to this, the Soviet Union is going to sign the Warsaw Pact, which is a collection and alliance of Eastern European countries. How was Israel created? In 1947, Israel was created out of Palestine by UN mandate. Korea, remember just before the war ends in Asia, just before we drop the second bomb on Nagasaki, the Soviet Union invades Southeast Asia. And one of the places that they invade is Korea, because Japan had taken over Korea. And so Korea was divided into North and South. The Soviet Union controlled the North, the United States controlled the South. Eventually, the Korean War, North Koreans came down into the South and were trying to take over all of Korea. The UN sent in troops led by Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, we've talked about a couple times now. In World War II, he liberated the Philippines from the Japanese, and then actually wrote the Constitution for Japan. And then before that, of course, we talked about Douglas MacArthur with the bonus marchers in Washington, D.C., breaking up those World War I veterans camps in Washington, D.C. In the Korean War, MacArthur undermined Truman's authority, and eventually Truman had to fire General MacArthur. The CIA stands for Central Intelligence Agency. It's our spy network, and it was set up to really spy on the Soviets and to see, or to try to figure out what they're trying to do. The Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill, obviously from Britain, said that there was an Iron Curtain that had fallen across Eastern Europe. Nothing can get across from west to east with this Iron Curtain. No messages, no people, no materials, nothing can get across this Iron Curtain. So it's describing the split between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Causes of the arms race, really because of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles believed in massive retaliation, mutual assured destruction, or MAD. In other words, if you send over one missile, we'll send over 20. And so nobody is crazy enough to start a nuclear war because everybody will be destroyed. Eventually, this is going to lead to bigger and better and more bombs. What was not part of Truman's foreign policy through 1952? Okay, NATO, the Marshall Plan, Korea, Berlin airlift or blockade, and the Suez Canal crisis. This is one where you have to know what actually went on during Truman's term of office. So NATO does, the Marshall Plan does, Korea does, the Berlin airlift is during his term of office. The Suez Canal crisis is just outside of Truman's term of office. It happens in 1955, so it's under Eisenhower. FDR and Truman differed in that Truman focused on civil rights. Truman has what's called the Fair Deal. Of course, FDR had the New Deal. The New Deal was mainly economic in focus, but the Fair Deal expanded on that and expanded into civil rights. The Fair Deal, the extension of the New Deal, including civil rights. Okay, the Taft-Hartley bill. Remember, after World War II, Congress goes from being Republican, or goes from being Democrat to Republican. Of course, our president goes from, in 1952, goes from being Truman, a Democrat, to Eisenhower, a Republican. And the Taft-Hartley bill was signed in order to do away with closed shops. Remember what we talked about? Closed shops means that only union members can work in a factory, or only union members can work in a certain place. And so if that happens, that makes the union very, very strong. And so the Taft-Hartley Act is a way to diffuse the power of unions. The AFL-CIO merger, why is that important? It strengthens unions throughout the United States. So remember, the AFL is really focused on skilled labor. CIO is really focused on unskilled labor, and so we're merging those two unions to make it stronger. Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy attacked government officials. He's America's #1 commie hunter. He's out there and he is saying, listen, there are 203 communists in the government, known communists in the government. I know who these people are, and if you question me, you are probably on the list. So anybody who questions Joseph McCarthy is automatically termed a communist, and they can be fired from their job. They can be blacklisted from other jobs. Much of Hollywood is going to be threatened because of this, but really people throughout the United States all they want to do is just keep their mouths shut and go to work and make a life for their families. Eventually, his downfall was going after military generals, and this is under Eisenhower, and of course, President Eisenhower, formerly the #1 general in World War II, is not going to put up with McCarthy going after military personnel. Joseph McCarthy was the chairman of HUAC. HUAC stands for House Un-American Activities Committee, and what they're doing is using the fear of communism for their political gain. So if you don't vote for certain groups of people, you must be a communist. So everything deals with communism. HUAC and Nixon both attacked communism. Remember, Nixon is right there with Joseph McCarthy, with Pat McCarran from Nevada, hunting down communists throughout the United States. Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was a State Department employee who was accused of giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Eventually, he was found guilty on perjury. They could not link him to actually giving secrets to the Soviets, but he was found guilty of perjury. And this is really what starts McCarthy's attack on government officials. Pat McCarran Internal Security Act. Pat McCarran was a Democratic senator from Nevada. Now, remember, Pat McCarran is right there with Richard Nixon. He's right there with Joseph McCarthy, hunting down communists in the United States. The Internal Security Act is said that any communist group must hand over their attendance rolls to the government. And then the government now has all these names on who is attending communist meetings. Now, remember, we can relate this back to the Palmer raids, where the government is raiding several different communities around the country, rounding up communists and deporting those assumed communists without any real facts behind it. Under the Internal Security Act, the Supreme Court reviews this and calls it constitutional. How is Eisenhower's modern republicanism different from prior Republican presidents? Wow, sorry about that. Eisenhower used this net of social welfare that was started under the New Deal, and he is going to allow that to continue. In some cases, he actually expands that. But, and this is not a very Republican thing to do. He calls it dynamic conservatism. He says anything that deals with people's money or the government, be conservative. But anything that deals with people, be liberal, be helpful to those people. The Interstate Highway Act, started by President Eisenhower, dramatically expands the highways throughout the United States. Initially, what this is meant to do is it's meant to protect America. We need to get troops from one side of the country to another side of the country or any part of the country very, very quickly. And before the Interstate Highway Act, most of those roads are going to be either dirt roads or two-lane roads and very, very slow. And so the Interstate Highway Act dramatically increases the amount of highways in the United States. Beatniks. Two of the major beatniks at the time are Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Both are writing about the 1950s silent generation. Remember, the silent generation are these people who have survived the Great Depression. They've survived World War II. All they want to do in the 1950s is get a good job, get some education, make some money, and make their families' lives better than what they had it. Well, Ginsberg and Kerouac and other beatnik writers are writing about this silent generation and not standing up for their rights. And when the government is going out there and they're accusing people of being communists, and it looks like, and in many cases is, the government is trampling on people's rights, this is what they are writing about. They are also criticizing 1950s conformity. So this idea that everybody has to be the same, that everybody has the same American dream, that there are other people out there that want something different. And this leads into rebellion of the 1950s, and of course it also leads into the rebellion of the 1960s. James Dean is a great example of one of these kids who are rebelling against conformity. Along with not only James Dean, but we have Elvis Presley starting in the 1950s. Rock and roll is a great way to rebel, and so these kids are pushing back against what is known as proper American behavior for middle-class kids. They're changing their clothes, they're wearing lots of leather, they're listening to rock and roll, and they're not the silent generation like their parents are. Critics of the 1950s protested the sameness of culture, conformity. We have in the 1940s the rise of the suburbs. The 728 square foot Levitt house, Levittown in Pennsylvania. We have all these houses that look exactly alike, and every house has a white picket fence, and every house has a tree in the front yard, and every single house is exactly the same. They're fighting against this conformity that Americans have to do and be like everybody else. What caused a rise in suburbia in the 1950s? Veterans Administration loans, the GI Bill is the best answer here. Because of the GI Bill, people get low interest loans and they are able to buy these houses outside of the city, and because of the Interstate Highway Act now, they can transport themselves into the city to work and then back out to the suburbs. The transportation system, we should note, comes a little bit later than the suburbs, but the highways are going to link all these suburbs with the inner city. The Earl Warren Court, what did it do? It championed 1950s minority rights, like Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In the 1960s, it's also going to champion rights of the accused. So Miranda laws, you have the right to remain silent, after being arrested. So the Warren Court. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka said that separate is always separate, but separate is never equal. And so what Brown Board of Education is doing in Topeka is it is starting the end of segregation. Remember segregation, we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which was really directed at the railroads, but then quickly expanded throughout the South. Same thing here, Brown versus Board of Education is focused at education, is focused at schools in Topeka, but quickly is going to be used to take apart this idea of separate but equal. The Little Rock Nine, Central High School, 1957. So this is 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Little Rock in Arkansas. 9 black kids wanted to go to Central High School. Of course, the governor of Arkansas does not want that to happen. The white families of Central High School does not want that to happen. The Arkansas National Guard at first is sent out to protect the school against these 9 kids. But eventually, Eisenhower is going to take the Arkansas National Guard and use it to protect these 9 black students as they're going into Central High School. Order of events in the 1950s: the Civil Rights Movement, integration of the military, 1948. 1948. This is just before the Korean War, and we have, for the first time ever, our military being fully integrated with blacks and whites. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Rosa Parks, 1955. Of course, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus and is arrested, and sparks the Montgomery bus boycotts of 1955. Central High School in 1957, and Greensboro, North Carolina sit-ins in 1959. We've touched on these sit-ins before. Remember what these are. These are lunch counters, not only in North Carolina, but really throughout the South. Black teenagers will sit at these lunch counters waiting to be served. Of course, they'll never be served, but meanwhile, whites will generally be throwing food at them, will be cussing them out as they are waiting to be served. Many times, these black teenagers will be arrested for disturbing the peace. The first thing to bring Martin Luther King Jr. to prominence or to national attention is the Montgomery bus boycott, which is sparked by Rosa Parks. Greensboro sit-ins, 1959, we've already touched on this, and Woolworths. Eventually this is going to work. This sort of thing is going to work because, remember, we have not a new invention, but a new way to use it, television. And so we have live TV watching this stuff and spreading this news throughout the United States. This can be really compared to the effect of Uncle Tom's Cabin back before the Civil War, and making Northerners more aware of what's going on. The Suez Canal crisis, 1955. Egypt takes over the canal. Before 1955, Egypt is attacked by Israel, Britain, and France. Well, long story short, the Suez Canal is very important for the transportation of oil going through the canal. And so the United States wants to make sure that area is protected. Well, the Soviet Union also threatens to come in on the side of Egypt. In kind of an odd case, the United States sides with the Soviet Union to protect Egypt's right to control that canal. And so So because of the Suez Canal crisis, President Eisenhower is going to use this to write up the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine is really focused on the Middle East, where the Truman Doctrine is focused on really Southern Europe, mainly Greece and Turkey. The Eisenhower Doctrine is going to be really focused on Egypt and protecting Middle East oil. Eisenhower Doctrine said to protect the Middle East from communism, the United States has will protect any countries that are under the threat of communism. The domino theory in Vietnam, remember what the domino theory said is if one country falls to communism, then ultimately every country will fall to communism, just like a stack of dominoes. And that last domino will be the United States. So we must stop communism wherever it threatens. And in Vietnam, we need to protect South Vietnam from falling to the communists. Dien Bien Phu, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, this is where the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese army, defeat the French. Remember, the French had colonized Vietnam, had protected it from communism. Now the Viet Minh had taken over not only North Vietnam, but also had kicked the French out of Vietnam. So now the United States has a question. Do we get more involved in Vietnam? Do we send troops over to Vietnam to keep it from falling to the communists? All right, the timeline of Vietnam here real quick. 1945 to 1954, the United States is helping the French. 1954 is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the French are kicked out. From 54 to 64, the United States will send military advisors to South Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese troops. In 1954, Vietnam is divided between North and South at the 17th parallel, and from 55 to 63, the United States will protect and set up a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem to run South Vietnam. Dulles and massive retaliation. John Foster Dulles said, we have already talked about this, first of all, comes up with this idea of MAD, mutual assured destruction. You send over one missile, we'll send over 20. 1957, Sputnik, the effective Sputnik, of course, this is the first orbiting satellite launched by the Soviets, freaks Americans out, and because of Sputnik, we put in a lot more money to math and science education in the United States. The military-industrial complex, what does that mean? It means that our economy is going to be not based on, but heavily influenced by building stuff for the military. And this is one thing that Eisenhower warns against on his farewell speech, is spending too much money on the military. Okay, let's do our dates. Number one, World War II begins. This is September of 1939. Number two, Pearl Harbor is bombed, December of 1941. Number three, World War II ends in 1945. Number four, the Berlin blockade, 1948. Number five, military is integrated by executive order by Truman. This is 48. Number six, NATO is formed, 1949. Number seven, McCarthyism announces a list of 205 communists in February of 1950. Number eight, the Korean conflict begins, June of 50. Number nine, the first hydrogen bomb is tested in 1952. Number 10, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Number 11, Rosa Parks, 1955. And number 12, Sputnik is launched in 1957. Okay, that does it for number 9. We have one more to go.